What if a children's toy from the 1980s held a secret so profound it could shift our perception of history? Today we're unboxing a sealed, unlabeled relic from 4 decades ago, and what's inside has the potential to reveal a reality more unsettling than you can imagine. My name is Daniel Hayes, and for the past 15 years I've dedicated my life to the archaeology of nostalgia. While others might dismiss vintage toys as mere relics of childhood, I've always understood them as time capsules, frozen moments of cultural consciousness wrapped in plastic and cardboard. My collection spans thousands of pieces from the 1970s through the 1990s, each one cataloged, preserved, and cherished. I've held prototypes that never made it to production lines, test market exclusives that only appeared in single regions, and factory errors that slipped past quality control. I thought I had seen everything this hobby could offer. I was catastrophically wrong. The package arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October, delivered not by the Postal Service but by a fellow collector named Elena Vasquez. Elena and I had met at a convention in Phoenix 3 years prior, bonding over our shared obsession with obscure toy lines. She had developed a reputation for unearthing items from the strangest sources: bankruptcy auctions of defunct distribution companies, estate sales of former toy executives, and the occasional warehouse demolition where forgotten inventory surfaced like archaeological remains. When she called me the previous week, her voice carried an unusual tremor that I had never heard before. "Daniel, I found something," she had said, her words coming too quickly, "at a property auction in upstate New York. An old shipping facility that closed in 1987. They were clearing out the basement storage and there were boxes everywhere. Hundreds of them. Mostly damaged, waterlogged, worthless. But in the corner, behind a collapsed shelving unit, I found one that was different. Completely sealed. Pristine. And Daniel, there's nothing on it. No labels. No barcodes. No company markings. Nothing." She refused to elaborate further over the phone, insisting that I needed to see it in person. When she arrived at my home that October morning, the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about the weight of what she carried. Elena was not a woman prone to superstition or dramatics. Her approach to collecting was methodical, almost clinical. Yet as she placed the box on my examination table, her hands trembled slightly. The box itself measured approximately 14 inches by 10 inches by 6 inches deep. Its dimensions suggested a playset or a larger action figure vehicle of some kind. The cardboard was pristine, untouched by the decades that should have yellowed and degraded it. No fading, no water damage, no compression marks from stacking. It looked as though it had been manufactured yesterday, yet the texture of the cardboard, the specific weight and fiber consistency, unmistakably belonged to the early 1980s manufacturing standards. I had handled enough vintage boxes to recognize the difference between modern reproductions and authentic period pieces. This was genuine. But that was where the normalcy ended. Every commercial toy from the 1980s came with an identity. Manufacturers plastered their boxes with logos, product names, UPC codes, safety warnings, age recommendations, and copyright information. These markings served practical purposes for retail, but they also became historical fingerprints that collectors used to trace origins and authenticate pieces. This box had none of these identifiers. Every surface was blank cardboard, a uniform shade of off-white that offered no clues whatsoever about its contents or origins. "I checked with 3 different auction specialists," Elena explained as I examined the seams. "They all said the same thing. The sealing tape is original. Period-correct adhesive. Whatever's inside has been there since the box was first closed, sometime between 1982 and 1986 based on their estimates. But they couldn't explain the lack of markings. One of them suggested it might be a display unit, something used internally at a company. But display units still have some form of identification, even if it's just a handwritten label." I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling for any indication that labels had been removed. There were no residue marks, no discoloration patterns, no evidence that anything had ever been attached and subsequently stripped away. The box was born blank, and it had remained blank for 4 decades. The weight distribution confused me further. As I carefully tilted the box in various directions, I could feel something substantial inside, multiple components that shifted with a muted plastic-on-plastic sound. Yet the weight seemed inconsistent, heavier in certain positions than the movement patterns would suggest. It was as though the contents responded to orientation in ways that defied simple physics, though I tried to convince myself this was merely an artifact of unusual packaging materials. Elena watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I've been having dreams since I found it," she admitted quietly. "About opening it, about what's inside. Every night since the auction. The same dream. I'm standing in a room I've never seen, and the box is on a table already open. And I'm looking at what's inside, but when I wake up, I can't remember what I saw. Just the feeling it left behind. Like I witnessed something that wasn't meant for me. Something that wasn't meant for anyone in this world." I wanted to dismiss her words as the product of an overactive imagination, a collector's excitement manifesting as nighttime fantasies. But I had known Elena for 3 years, and she was not prone to such fancies. Her confession unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The question of whether to open the box became a debate that consumed the next several hours. In the world of vintage toy collecting, sealed items carry significant premiums. An unopened package from the 1980s can be worth 2, 3, sometimes 10 times the value of its open counterpart. But value only applies to identifiable items. Without any way to verify what was inside this box, without any reference points to establish its rarity or origin, the sealed premium became meaningless. We couldn't sell something we couldn't identify. We couldn't insure something we couldn't categorize. The box existed in a state of commercial limbo. More troubling was the possibility that opening it might damage whatever historical significance it held. If this was a prototype from a never-produced line, the original packaging might contain documents or inserts that could establish provenance. Careless handling could destroy evidence we couldn't afford to lose. Yet keeping it sealed meant keeping ourselves in ignorance, allowing the mystery to fester without any possibility of resolution. By late afternoon, we made our decision. The mystery was too consuming, the questions too insistent. We would open it, but with the methodical care of archaeologists excavating a significant find. Every step would be documented. Every layer would be photographed. If this box held something remarkable, we would preserve its story even as we revealed its contents. I prepared my examination workspace with surgical precision. Document cameras positioned overhead. Multiple lighting sources to eliminate shadows. Clean white gloves to prevent oil transfer from skin. A sterile scalpel for tape removal. Climate control adjusted to optimal preservation conditions. Whatever secrets this anonymous package held, they would emerge into the light under the most controlled circumstances possible. As I positioned the box beneath the cameras, I felt a sensation I couldn't rationally explain. The cardboard seemed to pulse beneath my gloved fingers, a rhythm so faint it might have been my imagination or my own heartbeat transferred through contact. The room felt smaller than it had moments before, the air thicker, the silence more oppressive. Elena stood behind me, and I could hear her breathing quicken. Something inside that box had waited 40 years for this moment. And now, ready or not, we were about to meet it. The first incision through the sealing tape produced a sound I will never forget. It was not the simple whisper of adhesive releasing from cardboard. It was something closer to a sigh, as though the box itself had been holding its breath for 4 decades and finally exhaled at our intrusion. Elena heard it too. I saw her step backward, her hand rising instinctively to her mouth. Neither of us spoke. The document cameras recorded everything in merciless detail. I worked slowly, millimeter by millimeter, along the seam where the top flaps met. The tape was authentic to the period, a paper-based adhesive that had yellowed slightly at its visible edges while remaining stubbornly bonded to the cardboard beneath. Modern collectors tape yellows uniformly. This tape showed the specific degradation pattern of 1980s manufacturing, the irregular aging that counterfeiters never quite replicate correctly. Whatever was inside had truly been sealed for decades. As the final section of tape separated, the top flaps of the box relaxed slightly, loosening from the compression that had held them closed for so many years. The interior was dark, but I caught a glimpse of something white beneath the opening. Tissue paper. Pristine, undisturbed tissue paper wrapped around whatever lay within. This level of packaging care was unusual for mass-market toys of the era. Most items arrived with minimal protection, perhaps a simple plastic bag or cardboard insert to prevent damage during shipping. Tissue paper suggested something more deliberate, more ceremonial. I lifted the flaps fully and documented the first full view of the interior. The tissue paper filled the space completely, multiple layers wrapped around a central mass that maintained the rough shape of what I estimated to be a humanoid figure. An action figure of some kind, though larger than the standard formats popular in the 1980s. 12 inches, perhaps 14, based on the visible dimensions. This placed it outside the scale of most major toy lines from the period. G.I. Joe figures stood at 3 3/4 inches. Masters of the Universe reached approximately 5.5 inches. 12-inch figures existed, but they typically came in more elaborate packaging with clear plastic windows to display the product. My first spike of genuine unease came when I noticed the tissue paper. It was white, but not uniformly so. A pattern emerged as I examined it more closely. Faint lines of text, barely visible against the similar shade of the paper, repeated across the surface in rows. I adjusted the overhead lighting, increasing the angle to create shadows that might reveal the pattern more clearly. The text became marginally more visible, but I still couldn't read it. The letters belonged to no alphabet I recognized. They were neither Latin nor Cyrillic, neither Greek nor any Asian character set I had encountered in my years of examining international toy variants. "Can you see that?" I asked Elena, keeping my voice steady despite the crawling sensation at the back of my neck. She leaned closer, squinting at the tissue paper through her glasses. "It looks like writing," she confirmed, "but the characters are wrong. They're almost familiar, like letters I should recognize but don't quite. Like words seen in a dream that make sense while you're sleeping but become gibberish when you wake." The comparison to dreams struck me as uncomfortably appropriate given her earlier confession about her nighttime visions. I photographed the tissue paper from multiple angles before beginning the careful process of unwrapping. Each layer came away with that same sighing sound, as though the package was reluctantly surrendering its contents after decades of faithful guardianship. The toy emerged gradually, feature by feature, like a body being unearthed from ancient soil. First came the feet, encased in detailed boots that suggested some form of military or adventure theme. The plastic was not the bright primary colors typical of 1980s toys. Instead, it was a muted gray-green, almost camouflage but not quite, with subtle color variations that suggested either advanced paint applications or unusual molding techniques. The detail work exceeded anything I had seen from that era. Individual laces on the boots, textured rubber on the soles, microscopic stitching patterns molded into the cuffs. As more of the figure emerged, I began to understand why my instincts screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. The proportions were realistic rather than stylized. Most action figures of the 1980s featured exaggerated musculature, broadened shoulders, and heroic physiques designed to appeal to young boys' power fantasies. This figure had the proportions of an actual human being, anatomically correct in ways that would have been considered unmarketable in an era of cartoon-inspired toy design. The torso wore a uniform of some kind, but the design elements matched no military organization I could identify. Patches on the shoulders displayed symbols I had never seen. An insignia over the left breast pocket combined geometric shapes and patterns that felt simultaneously ancient and impossibly advanced. The fabric texture molded into the plastic was so detailed that I could see individual thread patterns, a manufacturing achievement that should have been decades ahead of 1980s production capabilities. Then I revealed the head, and everything I thought I knew about this artifact collapsed into confusion. The face was not generic. It was specific. It belonged to someone, a particular individual rendered with portrait-quality accuracy in molded plastic. The expression was calm but somehow knowing, eyes that seemed to track movement despite being painted surfaces, lips curved in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. The hair was styled in a manner I couldn't place culturally or temporally, and the ears were just slightly wrong, positioned a few millimeters too high on the skull to appear entirely human. "Do you recognize that face?" Elena whispered. I shook my head, but even as I denied it, something stirred in the depths of my memory. I had seen this face before, or something very like it, in circumstances I couldn't immediately recall. The figure held no accessories, but its hands were posed as though they had once gripped something. The fingers curled around absent objects, weapons or tools that were not included in the packaging. This was unusual. Action figures sold with the promise of accessories. Weapons, vehicles, and companion items drove the appeal. A figure sold alone, without playset potential, defied the marketing logic of the era. I turned the figure over to examine the back. Most action figures bore manufacturer stamps on the backs of their legs or between the shoulder blades. Copyright information, country of origin, date stamps, safety compliance marks. This figure had nothing. The plastic was smooth, unmarked, as anonymous as the box that had contained it. But as I tilted the figure beneath the examination lights, something caught my attention. Near the base of the spine, where a manufacturer's mark would typically appear, there was an indentation. Not text, not a logo, but a symbol pressed into the plastic. It was identical to one of the unreadable characters from the tissue paper, a complex glyph that seemed to shift slightly as the light moved across its surface. I photographed this symbol from every angle, trying to capture its details for later analysis. The document cameras recorded everything, but when I reviewed the footage afterward, the symbol appeared blurred in every frame, as though it actively resisted documentation. This was impossible. The cameras were high resolution. The lighting was optimal. Yet the symbol remained stubbornly indistinct in every image. Elena had grown very quiet. When I looked up from my examination, I found her staring at the figure with an expression of recognition mixed with horror. Her face had drained of color, and her hands gripped the edge of the examination table so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. "I've seen him before," she said, her voice barely audible. "In my dreams. Since I found the box. Every night. Standing in that room I don't recognize. And now I remember what I couldn't remember before. What I saw when the box was already open." She pointed at the figure with a trembling finger. He wasn't in the box anymore. He was standing in the corner of the room, watching me, smiling that exact smile. The temperature in my examination room seemed to drop several degrees. The figure lay on my table, motionless as any piece of molded plastic should be. But I could no longer shake the sensation that it was aware of us, that it had always been aware, waiting patiently for 4 decades to finally meet the people who would release it from its cardboard prison. I needed expert consultation, and I needed it immediately. Professor Theodore Whitmore had been the foremost authority on American toy manufacturing history for over 3 decades. His office at the university was a museum in itself, lined with reference materials, prototype documents, and original production molds donated by collectors and estates over the years. I had consulted him perhaps half a dozen times in my collecting career, always for authentication purposes on high-value acquisitions. He had never failed to identify an item's origin with meticulous accuracy. When I brought the figure to his office 2 days after the unboxing, his initial reaction was professional curiosity. He examined the construction techniques, the plastic composition, the joint articulation, and the paint application with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime studying such artifacts. For nearly an hour, he said nothing, simply turning the figure in his hands, studying it beneath magnifying lenses, and occasionally consulting reference books from his extensive collection. His first words when he finally spoke sent a chill down my spine that has never fully dissipated. "This cannot exist." He did not say it as hyperbole. He did not say it with the excitement of discovering something rare. He said it with the flat certainty of someone stating a mathematical impossibility, the way one might say that water cannot flow uphill or that time cannot run backward. "The manufacturing techniques used on this figure," he continued, setting the object down on his desk with visible reluctance, "did not exist in the 1980s. The plastic polymer alone is beyond anything that was commercially available until at least 2010. The articulation system uses ball joints with a tolerance level that would have required computer-assisted manufacturing processes that didn't become standard until the late 2000s. The paint application is layered in a manner that suggests digital color matching. something that was pure science fiction in 1985. I had brought the original box and the tissue paper for his examination as well. He studied the paper with even greater intensity than he had shown for the figure itself. When he examined the strange text patterns, he produced a specialized light source that revealed the characters more clearly than my overhead lamps had managed. What emerged made both of us catch our breath. The text was not merely unfamiliar, it was systematic. The characters repeated in patterns that suggested a genuine language, not random decoration. There were sentence structures, what appeared to be punctuation marks, paragraph divisions. Someone had written meaningful content on this tissue paper, but in an alphabet that corresponded to no known human language, living or dead. I have colleagues in the linguistics department, Professor Whitmore said slowly, but I hesitate to involve them. This feels like something that should be approached with extreme caution. The implications of what you've brought me are deeply troubling, and I want to be certain before we expand the circle of those who know about it. He pulled a thick binder from his shelves, a personal project he had been compiling for years, documenting every toy manufacturer that had operated in North America between 1945 and 2000. The binder contained records of companies large and small, successful and bankrupt, mainstream and obscure. He cross-referenced the unusual insignia from the figure's uniform against every known logo in his collection. Nothing matched. He searched for the symbol from the figure's back in databases of trademarks, patents, and corporate identities. Nothing appeared. The shipping facility where Elena had found the box had a documented history. It had operated as a distribution hub for a regional toy wholesaler from 1972 until its closure in 1987. Records of the company's inventory existed in various archives. Professor Whitmore spent an afternoon tracing the paper trail, attempting to identify any client or supplier that might have stored unlabeled product in the facility. Every lead terminated in verified, mundane companies with well-documented product lines. None of them could have produced this figure. The aha moment came when Professor Whitmore examined the date stamp hidden inside the figure's torso. Most articulated figures of the 1980s could be partially disassembled for examination, and this one proved no exception. Inside the chest cavity, visible only when the torso was split along its assembly seam, a date stamp had been pressed into the plastic. The format was unusual, not matching American or European standards, but it was clearly a date. The year indicated was 1984, but the month was expressed in a numerical format that included a 13th entry. There is no 13th month, Professor Whitmore stated the obvious. Our calendar has 12. Every calendar on Earth has 12 or fewer. This date stamp references a month that does not exist. We stared at each other across his cluttered desk, the weight of impossibility pressing down on both of us. The figure lay between us, that knowing smile still curving its too perfect lips, those painted eyes still seeming to track our movements despite their static nature. I want to propose a hypothesis, Professor Whitmore said carefully, and I want you to understand that I propose it not as a believer in the supernatural but as a scientist confronted with evidence that defies conventional explanation. This object appears to originate from a manufacturing process and a cultural context that did not exist in our 1984. The language is unknown. The calendar reference is impossible. The technology is anachronistic. The logical conclusion, however difficult to accept, is that this object comes from a different 1984, a parallel version of that year in which history diverged from our own timeline at some point, producing a reality where this figure, this language, this calendar made perfect sense. The words hung in the air between us. Parallel timelines, alternate realities, concepts that belonged in science fiction, not in a respected professor's office, not in the hands of a collector examining a plastic toy. But the evidence resisted any other interpretation. I left Professor Whitmore's office with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread that had nothing to do with ghosts or monsters. If this object had crossed from another reality into our own, what mechanism had allowed the transition? Was the crossing random, accidental, or deliberate? And most troublingly, was it unique, or had other objects made similar journeys, scattered across our world like debris from a collision we never detected? The The figure sat in my passenger seat as I drove home, secured in its original tissue paper and box. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me through the cardboard, that same knowing smile fixed on features designed for a world that never was. By the time I reached my house, the sun had set, and the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. That night, I dreamed of Elena's room, the one she had described from her recurring nightmares. I stood before an open box, staring at emptiness where the figure should have been. And from the corner of the room, I heard breathing that was not my own. The weeks following my consultation with Professor Whitmore became a descent into obsession. I could not stop thinking about the implications of what we had discovered, the vast and terrifying possibility that our reality was not as singular as we believed. If one object had crossed from an alternate timeline, there might be others. If there were others, they might be recognized by people who knew what to look for. I began searching. My methodology was simple but exhaustive. I scoured collector communities, auction archives, and estate sale records for any items described as anomalous, unidentifiable, or inexplicably different from known production variants. Most leads proved mundane: factory errors, prototype leaks, counterfeit products. But occasionally, I found references to objects that resisted explanation, items that had been quietly passed between collectors without ever being successfully cataloged. One name appeared repeatedly in these peripheral conversations: Victor Holloway, a reclusive collector who had been active in the 1990s before withdrawing from public participation in the hobby. His collection was legendary among those who had glimpsed pieces of it, rumored to contain dozens of items that he refused to discuss, display, or sell. He had last been definitively located in a small town in Vermont, living in a converted farmhouse filled with climate-controlled storage facilities. I tracked him down through a series of intermediary contacts, each one reluctant to provide the next connection, each one warning me that Victor Holloway was not a man who welcomed uninvited inquiries. When I finally obtained a mailing address, I wrote him a letter describing the figure in general terms, expressing my hope that he might have insight into its origins. I did not expect a response. His reply arrived 3 days later, handwritten on paper that felt too thick, too textured, like the tissue paper from the original box. "Come immediately. Bring the object. Tell no one else." The farmhouse in Vermont was exactly as rumored. Climate-controlled storage units occupied 3 converted barns on the property, each one secured with locks and monitoring systems that would have seemed excessive for a museum, let alone a private collection. Victor Holloway met me at the front gate, a man in his early 70s with sharp eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he gestured me toward the main house. "I've been waiting for someone to find one like this," he said as we walked. "I found my first in 1993, an unmarked box at an estate sale in Connecticut. A toy that didn't match anything in any catalog, a language that doesn't exist, a date that references impossible months. I've been collecting them ever since." He led me into the main house and then downstairs I hadn't noticed from outside, into a basement that extended far beyond the building's visible footprint. The underground space was vast, lined with shelving units that held hundreds of boxes, each one sealed, each one blank. "I've never opened most of them," Victor admitted. "After the first few, I became afraid of what we might be doing. Every time we open one, we complete some kind of circuit. We validate the connection between their reality and ours. I can feel it, Daniel. The boundary is getting thinner. Every year I find more of these objects. Every year the gap between what should be and what is grows narrower." He showed me his records, meticulous documentation spanning 3 decades. His earliest findings had been rare, 1 or 2 per year at most, but the frequency had been increasing. In the past 5 years alone, he had located nearly 100 anomalous items. They came from estate sales and warehouse clearances, from bankruptcy auctions and demolition salvage. They appeared in locations that had no logical connection to each other, scattered across the country without pattern. "I've developed a theory," Victor said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "In their reality, something went wrong. Something catastrophic. I don't know what. But whatever happened, they're trying to send things across. Messages maybe. Warnings. Or perhaps they're simply fleeing, throwing whatever they can through the cracks in hope that something survives." He paused, studying the figure I had brought with a haunted expression. This one is different though. The others are objects. Tools, toys, products designed for use and consumption. But this one has a face. A specific face. It represents someone. And I've seen that face before, Daniel. Not just in my collection. I've seen it in photographs from my grandfather's era. Photographs from a war that officially never happened. He retrieved a worn album from a locked cabinet, turning pages until he reached a section near the back. The photographs were old, black and white, depicting soldiers in uniforms I didn't recognize standing before ruins I couldn't identify. The quality was poor, but there was no mistaking the face that appeared in several of the images. It was the same face, the face of the figure, smiling that same knowing smile. These photographs were in my grandfather's personal effects, Victor explained. He served in the military from 1942 to 1946. These images are from what he called the Other Front, a campaign he never spoke about publicly. He said they fought something during those years. Something that wasn't supposed to be in our world. Something that came through before anyone knew the boundaries could be crossed. I felt the floor shift beneath me, though the ground remained stable. The implications of Victor's words collapsed decades of assumed history into uncertainty. If objects could cross between realities, if entities could cross, if a war had been fought against incursions that history had never recorded, then everything I believed about the world was incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. Why hide it? I managed to ask. Why keep this secret for so long? Victor's laugh was bitter. Because knowing doesn't help. Knowing only spreads the awareness. And awareness, Daniel, is what they want. Every mind that knows about them, every consciousness that acknowledges their existence, strengthens the connection. That's why I've kept silent. That's why I've collected instead of exposed. I'm trying to contain the breach, not widen it. He looked at the figure in my hands with something close to fear. But you've already opened yours. You've already connected. And now you're here, connecting my collection to your awareness. The circle is expanding, and I don't know how to stop it. That night, I slept in Victor's guest room, the figure secured in a climate-controlled cabinet alongside his other acquisitions. I dreamed again of Elena's room, but this time I was not alone. Others stood with me, dozens of people I didn't recognize, all staring at open boxes, all watching as the emptiness within began to move, to shift, to take form. I woke to find Victor standing in my doorway, his face pale in the pre-dawn light. "They're getting stronger," he whispered. "Can you feel it? Every time we talk about them, every time we acknowledge what we've found, the barrier weakens a little more. We may have already crossed a point of no return." I returned home from Vermont with more questions than I had carried there. The figure remained in my collection, secured in a locked cabinet that I checked compulsively several times each day. Elena called frequently, her dreams growing more vivid, more specific, more terrifying. She described rooms that didn't exist in any architecture she recognized, cities visible through windows that should have looked out on familiar landscapes, and always, the figure standing in corners just beyond her direct line of sight. Professor Whitmore continued his research, pulling in colleagues from physics and theoretical mathematics to examine the evidence we had gathered. Their responses ranged from dismissal to fascination to quiet horror. The consensus, such as it was, suggested that our reality might exist alongside countless others, separated by barriers that were supposed to be absolute but had somehow developed fractures. The objects we were finding were debris from those fractures, physical matter that had slipped through gaps in the fabric of existence. But no one could explain why the gaps were widening. No one could explain why the objects seemed to be increasing in frequency. And no one could explain why so many of them appeared to be children's toys, as though whatever was happening on the other side specifically targeted the artifacts of innocence. Victor Holloway's words haunted me. Awareness is what they want. Every mind that knows about them strengthens the connection. I had written this document, recorded these observations, and in doing so, I had expanded the circle of knowing beyond what could ever be contained. If Victor was right, this very account was feeding whatever force sought to bridge the gap between their world and ours. I considered destroying the figure, melting it down, burning the box, eliminating the evidence and hoping that the connection might fade without a physical anchor. But when I attempted to remove the figure from its cabinet, I found that my hands refused to cooperate. Not from fear, not from hesitation, but from simple inability. My fingers would not close around the plastic. My arms would not extend toward the shelf. It was as though my body understood something my conscious mind refused to accept, that the figure was no longer merely an object I possessed, but something that possessed me in return. Elena reported similar experiences. She had tried to throw away the tissue paper she had taken as a souvenir from the original unboxing. Each attempt failed. The paper returned to her possession through increasingly impossible means, appearing in drawers she had never opened, tucked into books she hadn't touched in years, folded neatly on her pillow when she returned from futile attempts to discard it. The figure's influence extended beyond physical possession. I began seeing the pattern everywhere. That strange alphabet from the tissue paper appeared in the margins of old books at estate sales. The impossible insignia from the figure's uniform showed up on vintage photographs that should have predated its design. The 13th month referenced on the date stamp appeared as a numerical anomaly in archived documents. Corporate records from the 1980s that listed fiscal quarters in impossible configurations. Victor stopped answering my calls after our second month of correspondence. When I finally drove back to Vermont to check on him, I found the farmhouse empty. Not abandoned, but empty in a more absolute sense. The furniture remained. The climate control system still hummed in the converted barns. But Victor Holloway was simply gone, along with every object from his collection. The sealed boxes, the documented anomalies, the photographs from his grandfather's unrecorded war. All of it had vanished, leaving behind spaces that felt too clean, too vacant, as though reality itself had been smoothed over to erase the evidence of what had been stored there. I am writing this account not because I believe it will help, but because I can no longer remain silent. The weight of what I know has become too heavy to carry alone. Others need to understand what we found, what we opened, and what may be coming through the gaps we have widened with our curiosity. The figure remains in my cabinet, smiling its knowing smile, waiting for whatever comes next. I have stopped trying to remove it. I have stopped trying to understand it. I have simply accepted that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, that some boxes should remain sealed, and that some toys were never meant for children of this world. But I have a question for you, the person experiencing this account, the mind now connected to the circle of awareness that Victor warned me about. Have you ever encountered something that felt wrong in ways you couldn't explain? An object that didn't quite fit the history you remembered? A product that bore no marks of origin, no evidence of manufacture, no trace of the reality it supposedly came from? If you have, I urge you to contact me. Not because I can help, but because we need to understand the scope of what is happening. How many objects have crossed? How many minds are now aware? How close are we to the threshold where the barrier finally fails and whatever exists on the other side finally steps through completely? The figure watches me as I write these final words. I cannot see it from where I sit, but I feel its attention, that portrait-quality face turned in my direction, those 2 high ears listening for the sound of my thoughts. It knows what I am doing. It knows that I am spreading awareness. And I believe, with a certainty that defies rational explanation, that it is pleased. There are more boxes out there, sealed and waiting in basements and warehouses and forgotten storage facilities. Each one contains a piece of a reality that shouldn't touch ours. Each one represents a fracture in the barrier, a crack through which something is seeping, slowly, patiently, inevitably. I opened one box. I revealed one figure. I asked questions that should have remained unasked. And now, every night when I dream, I find myself standing in Elena's room, staring at an empty box, while in the corner, the figure stands watching, no longer plastic, no longer still, its smile growing wider as the gap between worlds grows narrower. What do you think this toy means? Are there more out there? And most importantly, if you find one, will you have the wisdom I lacked? Will you leave it sealed, unexplored, its secrets intact? Or will you, like me, open the box and learn what waits inside? The choice is yours. But know this, they're watching. They're always watching. And every time another mind connects to this story, the barrier weakens a little more. Sweet dreams. The end.